Hey, I'm Enda Murray, the director of the Irish Film Festival. I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Adam Lowe, the director of Seamus Heaney, the music of What Happens. Adam, you're very welcome and congratulations on the wonderful film. One of the things that struck me about the film was that the sense of time. I really think that you captured that sense of the preview to the troubles, the early part of Seamus Heaney's life. I was interested in, first of all, the device you used were the poems of Seamus were begun by one person, and then I noticed when Marie started speaking, you heard her voice before you saw her.
The thing, we wanted to have as many poems in the film as we possibly could, obviously, because he's a poet, a fabulous poet. And luckily, Heaney recorded virtually all his poems up to kind of the 2010 or something like that, before he died. So we had a recording, a very good quality recording of him reading everything we wanted to use. So that meant that he could be in the film, not just archivally, but reading his own work. And because so many of the poems are very personal, a lot of them are dedicated to people who we met, it was very, very effective, I thought, for them to share reading the poem, so that somebody will begin reading the poem and then he'll take over. I can call him Seamus, I think, because I met him. So Seamus takes over and then we return to the original reader, so that you get this kind of inner sense of his mind as well as the outer sense of the person reading the poem.
Yeah, it does. I was interested how you sit down and approach, thinking through how you started off to devise the film. What kind of strategy you would use.
Yeah, well, you keep an open mind, I think, is the main thing. My background is I've made a lot of arts documentaries for the BBC, largely speaking. This was a BBC film. Some of them have been about writers, not all of them, but a lot of them. Some of them have been about poets. And so I had that kind of background. I dealt with that kind of subject before. And I think the film didn't come, it wasn't my idea. The film was proposed by my producers in Belfast, who have a company called Double Band. They're called Dermot Lavery and Michael Hewitt, and they approached the BBC. They're from Belfast, so they approached the BBC, and the BBC suggested that they got in touch with me and my producer, Martin Rosenbaum. So it was that kind of connection, but it was very important. I'm just saying that because it was very important that there was a Irish, specifically Northern Irish, beginning for this film, and then it became something that I and Martin became involved in. So you keep an open mind. I was familiar with Seamus's poetry. I actually met him when I was making another film about T.S. Eliot. I went to Dublin and talked to him there in 2009, a few years before he died. And he was, of course, delightful and wonderful and brilliant. And so it was important, I think, that I had met him, because previous subjects like W.H. Auden or T.S. Eliot, I hadn't met them. And so in having met him, I had a real sense of him as a person. And therefore it was easier for me, or it became apparent that I could make a more intimate film, if you like, because I had met the subject. That was an important aspect of it. And then, of course, reading the poems, which I was familiar with him, but I wasn't familiar with him in a detailed way. Reading the poems, it became clear how many of them were about his immediate family, about where he grew up. They were very personal poems, and so it became clear as well that it's not just true of him, it's probably true of a number of many other poets, but certainly of him, that you could tell the story through the poems. And that's how the film evolved in my mind. But the crucial thing, it's all very well to say, oh, let's make a film about Seamus Heaney. Who wouldn't want to do that? But, you know, you have to get the approval of the estate and of the family. And so it was really the involvement of the family that became so crucial. And we had various connections with them. Certainly my colleagues in Belfast, one of their friends, Neil Martin, was a very distinguished musician who'd worked with Seamus and knew the family. And I had made a number of films about writers who were published by the same publishing house in London as Seamus, called Faber and Faber. And so that was another way in for us. And I met his daughter, Catherine, who had in fact worked at Faber's at one point, through a friend of mine there. And we got on very well. And she was very instrumental and helpful in presenting this proposal to the family. Because you have to remember that when we began making this film, Seamus had only been dead for 4 years, and that's not very long in the life of a family, and certainly for Catherine's mother, Murray. So we couldn't just assume that they would want to even participate in the film, even if they were willing to authorize it. And so we needed to, you know, consult with them, ask what sort of film they would like, let them see the color of our eyes. And so we had a very, very pleasant lunch in Dublin with Murray and Catherine and her brothers, Michael and Christopher. And everybody got on very well. And that was the origin of the film. That was probably about at least a year, probably longer, before we actually finished it. And then we went up to Belfast, up to Balachi in the north, actually, and met his brothers, his surviving brothers. I was very intrigued to discover that, I think he was one of 9. One of his brothers was tragically killed in an accident as a child, so then he was one of 8. His 2 sisters had already passed away, but his 4 brothers were surviving and living in and around, we're within sort of 10 minutes drive of each other in the north. So we went to talk initially to Hugh, who is the oldest of them and who still farms the family farm, and through him met the other 3 brothers, all of whom appeared in the film, all of whom are different, all of whom are quite remarkable people in their own right. So that was great, you know, that we were given the sort of imprimatur really of Murray and the family, and they were very, very, as you know, they're Irish, they were extremely hospitable and friendly.
Yeah, I think that came across very strongly, the earthiness and you know, going back to Balachi and the shots of the countryside, the shots of the farm. Although it was a very ordinary farm, but it made that connection, and meeting his brothers for me, that was very strong. Like I suppose, you know, Seamus is known as a Nobel Prize winner for literature, but you know what was really strong for me was his brothers' affection and warmth, and to hear about him from them. Like I know in the past you did the Voices from Robben Island, so you were interested in politics. How strongly did Seamus Heaney's political views come across to you in the making of the film? I know that it's almost like a document of the Troubles.
It is in a way, because of course he was born at this very crucial moment in the history of his country. So he was positioned in a favorable way, in the sense that all of this happened in the course of his writing life, but in another way that became a very big responsibility for him. And he was very, very, very astute, I think, and humane about how he positioned himself. And he was very careful, although he came from, you know, as you pointed out, a modest Catholic background. He wasn't partisan in a kind of vocal sense particularly, and he was careful always to look, you know, to take a humane view of the situation and to see it from all sides, and not to in any way promote sectarian violence or anything of that kind. So, but at the same time, you know, to be honest about what he was feeling. And it was a very, very volatile situation that, of course, got tremendously serious at various points. And he did speak out from time to time. And he found ways of writing about the situation of the Troubles without being overtly kind of agitprop. I think just to kind of pull back to the background a bit, you know, as you say, the farm that he comes from, when you see it, when you physically see it, when you meet his brothers, you realize what kind of background he came from and how, you know, it wasn't impoverished, but it was simple. And, you know, the story is an extraordinary one, how a boy from that dairy farm in Blachi ended up being the Nobel laureate is just an extraordinary story to be able to tell. So that was what intrigued me. The politics were difficult because I'm not Irish. And when you go to Northern Ireland, and this is why it was so crucial that I had these Irish colleagues who are much, much more, you know, attuned to the sensitivities around how you depict the Troubles. And there are lots and lots of protocols about how you do that. You know, if you see somebody being injured or anything like that in the archival footage, you have to make sure that if that person is still around, that they're consulted or their family are. You know, there are lots and lots of issues about how you approach this topic, understandably. But I think, you know, it was definitely part of his subject matter, and he occasionally did write quite strongly about the situation, but mainly from the point of view of the human suffering that it was causing.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when you look at his CV, you know, from Balahi to Harvard to Oxford, it's quite a journey. I was going to ask you that when he came back in '71 from California, that I noticed that he moved back to Northern Ireland, but within a year he'd gone down south. It must have been quite a shock for him coming back from California to Belfast, 1971.
Must have been, mustn't it? Just from the sheer kind of grimness of it. I was in California in '68, and it was, you know, sunshine, flower power, all of these things. I mean, there were problems in the States. There were riots going on as well on the West Coast where they were. But coming back, I think he had got a real taste of freedom, if you like, artistically, creatively, in the States. And, you know, he had a young family. Things were really kicking off in Belfast at that point. Mari says in the film quite clearly that they didn't intend, it wasn't their intention to move to the Republic. They looked for somewhere in the north where they could, you know, have a quieter life. But then they were offered this very nice little cottage in Wicklow. And so that's where they went. And, you know, some people did accuse them of fleeing the north, but I think somebody said that one of the papers in Belfast said he'd gone to a spiritual home. But that apparently was not, you know, the intention was not to leave the north, but that's what they did. And it was interesting that he was therefore having to remember and having to observe what was going on in the north from the distance, either of Wicklow and subsequently Dublin, or from Harvard. But at the same time, you know, they went very frequently. I mean, Catherine says they went nearly every weekend up to Ardbow or to Blachi to see the grandparents and the family. So they were very, you know, very much, they hadn't sort of left the north in that sense. But yes, it must have been quite a shock to come back to grey, grim, violent Belfast after 6 months, whatever they had in Berkeley, I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah. Do you think his his attitudes mellowed as he grew older? I noticed that he turned down a laureate a poet laureate with a, but his verse was pretty jolly. I think it brought a smile to my lips anyway. The little poem that he wrote.
Well, he said, but no, my passport screen, no glass was ever raised to toast the Queen. That one.
Exactly.
Well, I think he thought, what a cheat. I mean, it was a serious situation, and it was, in his opinion, clearly a colonial situation. So I don't think he was seriously mooted as being the poet, asked to be the poet laureate. I may be wrong, but certainly he didn't have any qualms about being the professor of poetry at Oxford or any of those, connections with Britain. And he was very, 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 of course, enamored of English, and certainly of things like, one of the things that is a slight regret about the film is that Beowulf, his translation of Beowulf, which is fabulous and I'm very fond of, isn't in the film. Certain things we just couldn't find room for, and the translations were, which he did a number of. One of them, the Cure at Troy, has been quoted a lot recently in regard to the American election. The chorus at the end, talk about hope and history rhyming. That's become viral recently. So he's very eminently quotable. But he loved English, and he loved early English, and so he was a very kind of multifaceted, and possibly, in fact, so there's a sort of conflict as well. But yeah, I don't think he would have ever accepted the laureateship.
I've heard it said that one of the attractions of Irish people speaking English is that they are not more than 2 generations away from having been speaking Irish, and that maybe that there's some kind of a extra effort is made to find those words. I'll just throw that in there, but
I'm not sure to what extent and what generation his family did speak Irish or not. But I think certainly Ulster Irish, if you want to call it that, is also very particular and inflected with all sorts of Scottish words as well. So I think it's a very particular, almost a dialect, and he was very fond of it. And of course, one of the great aspects of his poetry is the sound. He was incredibly acutely aware of sound and used sound in a very kind of robust way, but he could also be very lyrical with it. A poem like Digging, has all of these crunchy sounds in it. So he was very, very, and when you hear his brothers and the family, indeed, Murray, reading the poems, it's a very different experience to if I was reading it, for instance. But the brothers, to hear Charlie, his brother, reading Digging is quite an extraordinary thing. It takes on a different life.
Yep. I thought for me, your film really captured the sound of the words, and I came away from it a bigger fan. I suppose as a lot of Irish people, I know about Joyce, but not many people have read all of the books, and a little bit the same with Seamus Heaney. But I suppose what I really liked about the film, again, that sense of time, and brought it really resonated with me in that bringing back that time, and I thought he did a marvelous job with the readings and just hearing that orality of the language.
Yes, exactly. And I think just time as well is always, when you're doing a life, you're trying to be, obviously, condense it. We needed to have quite a long film. It's a 90-minute film, which is important. But it's broadly chronological, and that's important, I think, particularly with a situation like the one in Northern Ireland, where it has to be clear when things start, how they escalate, how they hopefully end. So that, again, looking back on that history, we also have the advantage of there being a peace process which had already happened by the time Seamus died. So that was an important aspect of it. Also, there's an extraordinary amount of archive footage of Northern Ireland in that period for the very reasons, you know, this unfortunate reasons that we know. So there was a great wealth of material that we could use, and I had a very, very excellent film researcher working for us. So, but again, you know, you have to be careful. So much of that material has been seen. You have to be very aware of being even-handed and not being sensational, and that's something that takes quite a lot of effort. And it's not just me making this film. I should point out I have, you know, many colleagues working on it, and a wonderful film editor called Joanna Crickmay, who I've worked with a lot, and we spend a lot of time sorting through the archive and, you know, working on that particularly.
Yeah.
So you get these sort of parallel stories, and then in the middle of it all, you go to America, which is a rather extraordinary thing. Thinking of the way that he's just been quoted in the election, you know, that he had this American connection from very early on. And Boston is effectively, you know, an Irish city after all, isn't it? So he was at Harvard. But that was a very unknown to me aspect of his life. And it was interesting when I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to meet a couple of poets that he taught there? And we met these two amazing African-American poets, Tracy K. Smith, she was the American Poet Laureate at the time that we filmed her, and a wonderful poet called Kevin Young, who is the poetry editor of the New Yorker. So they were interesting as well, to see how he had influenced poets like themselves in America. It was a very unexpected aspect of the story. Sorry.
Yes, it is interesting. You mentioned the elections, and while doing the research, I came across the Biden ad where he voices the cure at Troy, and I think very, very effectively. So it's great to see that his words are still in use and still being celebrated. So, hey, Adam, thanks very much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and our festival is online, and I know that this is going to be a very popular film, so it'll be all across Australia. So thanks again for your time, and take care.
Thanks for showing the film. I look forward to it. And will my family, I've got family in Canberra, they'll be watching it.
Fantastic. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.